everyone. This is Dillard coming to you with Teen Talk Live. We have been on a little break because I've been on the mission field in Senegal, West Africa. Thank you all for those of you who followed us all the way to Senegal and back. And I'm so glad that you are here with us tonight. All the way to Senegal and back. Okay, I'm getting a little feedback, so I have to try to figure out how we do this. All the way to Senegal and back. Okay, I'm getting a little feedback, so I have to try to figure out how we do this. All the way to Senegal and back. Okay, so to my guests, do you all have your phones muted? This sounds just really spooky right now. Okay, all right, I think I've got it figured out. Okay, that sounds a lot better. All right, good evening again. This is Dillard coming to you with Teen Talk Live, where we transform the lives and minds of teens and those who love them. And tonight I have three really exciting guests here to share with you. Tonight we're just going to jump right in. We have a very important topic that we're talking about. Yesterday on CBS 60 Minutes, Oprah Winfrey presented a special on childhood trauma, and I thought it was very insightful. It was just amazing to hear her talk about that and for it to get so much airtime and so many views. Very informative platform, and so I have gathered some of my colleagues here who will be joining me to have a discussion with you about childhood trauma and specifically how it impacts the lives of teens. And help me welcome our guests, and I'm gonna unmute them so that they can share with you. We have Latasha Carter. Latasha, welcome.
Thank you.
That you're here. Would you tell our guests who you are and how you serve?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Latasha Carter, and I am CEO of Therapeutic Connections in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I specialize in trauma and addiction, and I service adolescents 14 and up and the adult population here in Greensboro. So I'm definitely excited to talk about a topic that I'm so passionate about.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you're going to share your expertise with us. And I'm particularly excited to hear more about the addiction part and how trauma influences that and how they influence each other, actually. Thank you. And our next guest, Amanda. Amanda, how do you pronounce your last name? I forgot to ask you that.
Flood, like Noah's Ark and the flood. Easy.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're here, Amanda. Tell us about who you are and how you serve the world.
Sure. So my name's Amanda Flood. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker in New York. I work for a state facility for children, actually, and we service kids like as young as age 6 all the way to 18. And then because of that work, I realized there was a lot of like gaps in our community. So I actually went into private practice work. So I service young people to adults there. And it's really been a good experience, but most definitely, trauma has been prevalent within those systems.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And, when you say 6 years old, that just kind of scares me a little bit.
It's crazy. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but it's true and it's real.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for being here. And our next guest is Sarah. And Sarah, tell me, how do you say your last name?
Elizabeth.
Elize. Okay, wonderful. I'm so glad you're joining us. Tell us who you are and how you serve in the world.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Elize, and I am a psychotherapist in South Florida. I work primarily with foster care families and providing CPPs, psychotherapy, and dietic therapy for children 0 to 5 and their parents. And I also have a private practice where I work with women, children, and teens, and specializing in trauma and anxiety, PTSD, and depression.
Wow, thank you, and it's so amazing that each of us have a special area that we focus on, and really looking at children and the mental health need. It's such a wide span. You're talking about working with children as young as what was the age group? 3?
0 to 5.
Zero. Okay, 0 to 5. Offering mental health services. This is incredible, and so I'm so glad that you all are here again to share your expertise with my audience. And I'm just going to take a minute to welcome all our guests and thank you for being here. We're hoping for an interactive session. Again, this is a very important topic and one that we don't talk about enough in our community. Sandra, I'm glad you're here. Javante, glad you're here. Piavani, thank you for joining us. Hey, Tanya, um, thank you so much for being here. Darsha, I'm glad you're here. And Sister Sandy, Sharon, and my husband Joseph is on. Thank you for joining us. Just say hello, everybody, and shout out to our our panelists who are here. Hey, Kathy, thank you for being here. Ahmed, I'm glad you're here with us tonight. So we are looking, Alicia, I'm so glad you're here. Rakita, thank you for joining us. We're looking to have an interactive conversation because we have a panel of experts in this area dealing with children and adolescents. And this is such an important topic that we're talking about. So, ladies, we all saw Oprah's presentation on 60 Minutes last night. And I'm just going to go around and ask you, what is your impression of the show that we saw? And let's start with Latasha.
Okay, I'm up first. I was very excited to actually see the segment and to just have some increased awareness about trauma. We talk about trauma a lot. However, I think from my experience, when people associate trauma and PTSD, they typically think of the military or some type of war or something like that. And so they don't really realize how much we're actually impacted by trauma and how, it can affect our development in our everyday lives. And so I've decided to just see that Oprah was on board. And, I thought when she did an interview with Gail, I was a little bit surprised, about her comments about the PTSD and kind of being dismissive there. So it definitely lets us know that we have a little bit more work to do in the area. But overall, I thought it was a nice segment. And I was really proud of the young lady who talked about her sexual abuse and how it had impacted her in ways that she's being treated. So I hope just across the globe that we'll begin to use the ACE and more people will become a little bit more informed on trauma.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Now, you referenced the ACE. Can you tell us what ACE stands for and the acronym ACE stand for and what is it? Latasha, you can tell us.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. All right. Well, the ACE, I know that Sarah talked a lot about being able to use the ACE, the assessment in which they actually check for the children and to indicate the risk, high risk that they have for trauma. And so a lot of people talk about being using that in the schools, maybe having pediatricians use the assessment as it relates to trauma. And so it's just a tool that is relatively new. I don't typically work with a lot of younger children, but I know Sarah spoke to actually using that and how it has been impacted. And sometimes what I find with using the tool is that it may not always be indicative of some of the trauma that's being some of the children are being experienced at home.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Shout out to our guests for joining us. Thank you so much, Natalie Johnson-Lee, for being here. Tisha, thank you for being here. I know that this is really relevant information for you all and the population that you serve. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the ACE, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences, and talk about how you use it in your work and your reaction towards the segment that was aired last night.
Okay, so with the ACE questionnaire, I've used it with the parents that I work with, primarily since I work with children who are very young, newborns to age 5. And I've used it with the parents. And what I've found with the use of the ACE questionnaire is some of the trauma that my clients have been experiencing are not on the ACE questionnaire. So it kind of it's very helpful, yes, but it's kind of not helpful for me in my practice where those trauma are not being presented on that questionnaire. So although that my clients have experienced multiple traumatic experiences, I find it difficult using the ACE to be able to use that assessment and put it into the treatment for those clients. But for those who have the trauma that on that questionnaire that they've experienced, it has been very helpful because I've been able to address those experiences and actually create individualized treatment plan based on that assessment for those clients.
Mm-hmm. So you said something that was really important, and I think we need to clarify for our audience. You said you serve 0 to 5, but you don't use the ACE with the clients because they're so young. You use it with the parents. Why? If that's not the client, how come that impacts the child?
In that environment and in that population, specifically with the foster care population, those parents that I work with, and my work is to actually help with the child-parent relationship and to help strengthen it, because there have been some challenges based on different allegations as to why the child has been removed. And we work on reunifying that child with the parent. But before being able to be reunified, you have to actually strengthen that child-parent relationship and whatever concerns that are going in that relationship. So in terms of using the ACE and actually working with the parents, I also take a multi-systemic view where I don't only work with the parent, but I also work with the school and just everyone who is in connection with the family as a whole, to be able to provide them a well-rounded treatment plan. And with the parent, when I work with them, we have to think about like the ghost in the nursery, where these parents, they have their own traumatic experiences where they have yet to even address. And when you don't address your trauma, it actually affects the relationship you have with your child.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because, parents parent as much as they know. Mm-hmm. And so they are going to pass on inevitably those things to their children or to their child.
So if I can just jump in.
Yes, Amanda.
So I just want to share a little background on the ACE study also, because I'm also a trauma trainer, and it's one of the things that we do talk about. So it was one of the largest studies done, and they took like 17,000 just regular workers, and they gave them the questionnaire, and the questionnaire asked for things like if you've experienced things like neglect, abuse, absent parent in the home, someone who was an alcoholic, domestic violence. And what they looked at was the correlation between these childhood experiences and what happened in adult life. So if you had one ACE score, which I think like 20-something people had, that was kind of okay. But the more exposure you had to these childhood experiences, it increased your likelihood of things like depression. We find increased rates of like suicide. And then there's also the direct correlation to health. So stress in general, it raises like your cortisol, right? So if you find things like we may be overweight more like heart issues, and we all know, especially for Black folk, we've got high blood pressure, high cholesterol, all sorts of high, but a lot of it is related to these childhood events. So exposure to chronic trauma raises your stress, and that in turn affects your body. So it kind of connected what happens in childhood and the importance. And to go back to what Sarah is saying, trauma is actually very generational. So even if the child never experienced trauma, if the parent did, it really affects your ability to like connect with the child or to connect with anybody in any sort of relationship. So it makes it harder to bond if you're not really there for your child and they can't feel that sense of security with you because of your own, security issues or trust issues or, emotional issues that kind of prevent you from being present. It's a child that grows up feeling like the world is not there for them. So you're already raising their likelihood of being exposed to things like, depression and having difficulty in schools. And so this is where it becomes like this generational issue with trauma.
Thank you. That's very insightful. And Amanda, I know that you have to leave early, so I'm going to say to my viewers, if you have questions for Amanda, just pop them in, and she's going to also leave her contact information in the comments section. But Latasha, I want you to piggyback on what she was saying about that secondary trauma, which if you don't take care of your own trauma, you're inevitably going to pass it down to your child.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about secondary trauma, I think a lot of times, we don't necessarily look at, how our children are being impacted, by that trauma. So we think maybe if we don't discuss it with them or if they didn't witness it directly, that they will not be impacted by that particular trauma. But they are also, impacted by that trauma. And so that's when we talk about secondary or indirect trauma, how it can affect, people in our home or people we're having contact with. Even as clinicians, we are affected by, secondary trauma because we are speaking with these individuals who have experienced significant traumatic events, and a lot of times reliving that when we're talking to them about the details, when they're having the flashbacks and things of that nature. And so those are ways that we can be impacted by post-traumatic or secondary trauma.
Right. And, when I was thinking about the segment when Oprah was being interviewed by Gail, and she kind of was dismissive of the fact that she could possibly have PTSD. And typically we think about PTSD as something that only service men and women experience. Mm-hmm. But PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, could be experienced by anyone. And now we're talking about secondary PTSD, which I have a large teacher and educator population, and I see firsthand how my teachers are affected by the traumatic stories that their students bring. Can somebody speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's vicarious trauma. So because really you kind of like inhibit it, like we use our senses for life. So, when kids talk about things, you start to visualize things yourself. If you're a very like sensory in tune sort of person, you start to like kind of feel it to the point that you may even like smell what they smell, like kind of thing. And you take that home with you, sometimes whether or not you realize it, in the same way, with this whole generational concept as well. So if you notice things like you're more tired than usual, if you notice things like you're working with a certain kid and it's like, man, I'm exhausted after this kid, or even as a therapist, if you're like, oh my God, like what's happening after this client, or you're dreading dealing with a particular student or client or a particular class, that could be because of your own sort of exposure to the situation. Because we tend to really throw ourselves in there. So we have to be mindful of sort of like taking a step back sometimes, grounding ourselves, taking some deep breaths, being aware of how much we're visualizing things. If you are very visual, don't visualize, kind of practice not doing that and taking some steps back, because it can absolutely go home with you mentally and physically.
That's really key. That's really key. Thank you for our guests who are joining. Miss Teresa, I'm glad you're here. Hey, Samantha, thanks for joining us. And Joseph said this makes a lot of sense, but it's not something that we would automatically connect or relate to each other. And he was saying that it's great insight and information about trauma. And I think that is indicative of the conversations that we need to have, because we don't talk about it as much. One of the things that I also want to talk about is as African Americans, we're all African Americans here. Church is a significant part of our upbringing, or has been historically. And so a lot of times when I have clients who are, from the church, a lot of times they'll say, well, I don't want to talk about it, because if I talk about it, I'll give life to it. I'll just pray about it. But then they see the same thing happening generation after generation after generation. Does anybody have any experience with that and can speak to that?
I'll speak to that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in terms of speaking about the trauma, that's what we call like the trauma narrative. And with the trauma narrative, it's very important for that client, for the person to actually start speaking speaking their truth, and to start putting to life what is going on the inside. And when it comes to church, of course, you may be told to, not speak it, and the life of the power of the tongue. There's a lot of things in the power of the tongue where you speak things into reality. But for me, I would say also, when you start to speak about what's going on and start letting that trauma go, then in terms, when it comes to treatment, you can also, let's say for church, as they say, okay, speak positive, and you can start to overcome by speaking positive against what has been going on, against those symptoms. And I've actually have some clients who, in terms of counseling, where we incorporate, their faith,
right.
And by incorporating their faith, we talk about, hey, okay, yes, you have experienced this trauma. Yes, we're doing the trauma narrative, but let's start speaking life into you overcoming. Let's start speaking life into how you want to be once you have addressed the trauma.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's having the church and your spiritual upbringing as a part of the treatment plan is such a healing mechanism. And I think you are so right with using it and changing the narrative around that. Tisha said, yes, being exposed and drained by family members also. Family members who are going through trauma and don't necessarily have the tools to deal with it. And Davina, thanks for being here. And Jenny says that it took her husband a while to understand why she couldn't come straight home after dealing with clients, because she brings the stories home with her. And that is so true. One of the things we learned to do when we were going through training is to do self-care ourselves as clinicians, and how to get that off of you so that you can move on and not internalize all of that, because it's quite emotional. So Latasha, I want to talk to you specifically about how do we see trauma show up in the teenagers that we serve?
Okay. So with a lot of our teens, they begin to act out. I know when we were specifically in schools, I've done a lot of research, and it talks about children being misdiagnosed as being ADHD. And so they may be zoning out, disassociating, and that is sometimes misread for inability to pay attention. We also see them maybe turning to substance abuse or risky behavior. So maybe they're being a little bit promiscuous. Maybe they are starting to use marijuana. Maybe they're spending an excessive amount of time on video games or television, things of that nature. You may see them have a significant change in their sleep pattern, nightmares, avoidance of particular family members or areas in which remind them of that traumatic event. They may be a little bit more aggressive, or start to isolate and start withdrawing. So maybe they were very involved in a lot of activities at school or in the community, and now you start to see them not wanting to attend those things. So those are just a few.
Wow, that's really important, and those are really good tips to look for. I remember when I was in Minnesota and we had a tornado. I think it was 2012. We had a tornado, and it was really bad, especially on the north side of Minnesota. And I was working in the school system then, and every year, the teachers would see a rise in behavioral issues around that time. And so I began to educate the teachers about trauma and how it impacted the children. Like, in the schools where there's a bell, they use the bell. And so that would set off the kids often during especially that time of the year. And it was like May 22nd or something like that. And so they began then to take certain precautions around that time of the year when the body remembers and the children are reliving that trauma of the tornadoes in North Minneapolis. So Amanda, I know you got to run. So I want you to give us some closing remarks if you're talking to teenagers, parents of teenagers, or youth workers about trauma and what they might be seeing. Give us some insights or some tips.
I think especially for parents, it's hard because you want your child to be able to talk to you. But I think one of the things we have to remember too is that in adolescence, it's really all about finding who you are. And we always find that really with our peer groups. And even as parents, it's really the period in life where we're preparing them to launch into the world. So it kind of makes sense that you're not their first resource. And, they don't always know how to express what's going on with them too. And they may not always know how to respond to you, which can be frustrating. And if you're always letting that frustration out, yelling, angry, taking things away, that's not helping them either. So I think it's important as a parent to show up and keep giving that love and support, even when they're giving you their worst, which could be, we're not listening, we're coming home late, we're always locked up in our room, but also take those things as real signs that something is really wrong and going on, and get help. Use their social resources if you need to. There are the young people that you can ask, what's going on with my kid? Do you think they need help? Sometimes friends will reach out in that way. Take it seriously, and be open to things like therapy. I think it's changing our relationship with therapy. People are more willing, and it's really just another resource for you. I see it as the skills to navigate life. We don't have an opportunity to learn it anywhere else. And this is our opportunity to learn it, with our kids if they need it. So please seek help. Don't be afraid of that, and recognize the changes in your young people. In my work, we're seeing too many young people that want to take their lives because they don't have the right resources. So don't wait for that situation.
I think that's one of the things that Bruce Perry said on the interview last night was that relationship is the key, and that's what really heals trauma. Turning those relationships around and having people to stand in the gap for you relationally, and I think that is so very important. We've been saying that forever as therapists, that relationship is really the key to healing traumatic experiences. Anybody want to?
I love that, because that relationship could be like their coach. It could be their maybe there's a community leader in their church. I teach Sunday school, and we have some great discussions with our young people. We bring up things like bullying, anger, all of those things too. So it doesn't have to be you, but you can also set them up with great adult resources in their lives too, and kind of use that. So I love that point that you made. Those relationships and connections are absolutely important. And I'm going to dip out now, but thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. My information is there if you guys need it. Thank you. Great forum.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for joining us, and we really appreciate your expertise. So, So Sarah, tell us about what are some of the signs that we'll see in kids, because as we do this trauma work, we know that it affects the memory, it affects behavior, it affects so many things in children. Help us understand some more about that.
With children, especially with the population that I work with the 0 to 5 population, we often see a lot of irritability and frustration and aggressive behaviors. Sometimes are mixed diagnosed with ADHD, where that child is so young and they can't find how to express themselves as we adults do. So you might have a child who's hitting, Billy and pinching, and you might have a child who's very withdrawn and very quiet, and you may have a child who doesn't want to eat or doesn't want to participate in any activities. And sometimes we look at that child and some may label that child as being bad, but it's just that they can't fully express themselves, and the only way they can express themselves is to get angry or to hit so-and-so, or just to withdrawn. And that's a lot of the behaviors that I've seen with that population. And also you may see it in your own household where you're like, oh my gosh, my preschooler is getting got expelled from school, is getting suspended from school, and you're like, wow, a 4-year-old is getting suspended. Well, every behavior, there's a root to every behavior, and I think it's very important that we do look at what's going on with that child and not just say, oh, they're just being bad, or that's just a bad seed. No, there's a root cause to every problem. A child is not just acting out because they want to. They're actually calling out for help, and they just don't know how to do it the way that we do as adults.
Or you would hope that we do.
Oh, you would. Yes.
Right? Because the reality is, if we don't get our stuff taken care of, and if we don't learn skills ourselves, we end up acting like those 4-year-olds sometimes.
Agreed. Yes. You actually, sometimes you see it in adults and you're like, oh my gosh, like, when are you going to grow up? And it may be some sort of, the trauma in your own life, in your past childhood that you never addressed. And sometimes we don't even know that we never addressed that trauma because we tuck it away and never thought about it, because that's another defense mechanism where you repress those feelings and those experiences because it was so hard for you to actually face it. And I am actually ecstatic that the conversation is beginning and that Oprah actually is leading the way. I think we should use this as a platform to start educating others on the impact on trauma, on not just adults, but on children, on also teenagers, and now we can stop. We can start to look at to see why they're behaving the way that they do.
That's great. Latasha, when during the interview yesterday, Bruce Perry said something that was really important. And I started using this way back when I read his first book about the boy who was raised as a dog. And he said, we must ask what happened to that person instead of asking what's wrong with you. And a lot of times that's the first thing that comes out of our mouths. It's like, what's wrong with you? Instead of what's happened. I want you to speak to that a little bit, because we're talking about trauma. And some people might be wondering, what is trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's this notion of what is wrong with you? What are you doing? You're acting differently, and everything that has like a negative connotation as opposed to reframing the question. And so it also projects a lot of shame and guilt onto the person. So, automatically they may be struggling to even talk about this traumatic experience or this thing that has happened. And now we say, what is wrong with you? So we already project that negativity, that shame onto that person and make it even more difficult. So I think we definitely have to be mindful in how we lead those discussions, especially that we provide a safe and a judgment-free zone, to foster a very trusting environment to begin to have some dialogue about, what's going on, what maybe some things that you're experiencing. I noticed some things are changing. You want to talk a little bit about that to just make sure that we are engaging, being present, with that individual, with that child, talking about their normal routine and not being dismissive or being negative, or shaming that individual, or either fault finding, making something about that person's, making something that person's fault.
Right. And I think that there is so much shame attached with trauma. And shame, a lot of times, well, I'll say kids don't necessarily traumatize themselves. A lot of times kids experience trauma, most times, because of the lack of responsibility that the adults in their lives have taken. And so when we look at that, the child or the person who's being traumatized usually embody that shame and carry that shame, which is really not theirs to carry. And what I want to do is I want to talk about what are some of the things that happens in people's lives that can cause trauma.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought this up just so we can kind of talk about, so people can be able to recognize everyday things that they may be experiencing, that is identified as a traumatic experience, a distressing event that could occur. That could be loss of a job is a traumatic experience. Relational breakups, whether you're married or not married, that relational breakup could be a traumatic experience for you. Sexual abuse, assault, domestic violence, grief or loss, anything that is distressing to you, any distressing event that has occurred in your life, could be defined as trauma. I mean, we also know that trauma is a physical injury, but outside of that, from an emotional standpoint, anything that is distressing. And then when we talk about, just to link it to PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, we talk about when you experience that traumatic event, and then you don't deal with it, it's not properly treated, what could show up later. And those are the psychological effects, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So just to kind of tie those things together, because I know we use them and we talk about them interchangeably, and people may not really understand, what is this PTSD? How does this relate to trauma? Relate this to me and what I'm actually going through. So hopefully I've been able to shed some light on that. And so when we talk about trauma and traumatic experiences, you may be able to relate, as opposed to thinking, hey, I'm not a veteran or haven't served in the military, anything like that. You'll be those things applicable to your daily life or someone that you know.
That is so true. And something not simple, but an event as like a car accident, that is traumatic.
Yes.
And people might not even think about that, but think about a child who was in a car accident and now, you see signs of PTSD, because every time the child goes into the car, then him or her might start to have, some kind of reaction to that and some emotional distress about that. But we don't necessarily think about, how that is impactful. Another thing that we don't think about is the amount of violence that our children are watching on television or engaged in on video games and things like that, or social media. Those are also traumatic events. And that's not minimizing it. That's significant. Can you say some about that, Sarah?
Yes, agreed. And now with like the YouTube videos, and we do have a lot of kids who are watching the YouTube videos, and I think it's very important that we actually monitor what they are watching, because sometimes they won't be able to understand, okay, this is just a cartoon, and so and so got hit over the head, and or this person is talking about killing so and so, and they start to process that in the best way they can as a child. And I think it's very important that we do monitor that as well, and actually pay attention to what's going on with the child. And also we think as children as, oh, they're just a kid, they'll get over it, or they don't understand what's going on. But if you actually do sit down and you ask, your child, hey, what do you think about this? And you start to hear what they say about certain situations, it might shock you a little bit to see that, this little person does have feelings, and this little person is being impacted with what's going on in the world and things around them. I'm glad that you gave the example of like the car accident, or if we want to move it further, where since we do work also in the Black community, and we do have a lot of racial tension going on, and we might have parents who are having those conversations at home, and you may think that your child is they don't get it, they're young, they don't understand what's going on, but it might be impacting them as well, where they start to think, am I okay, like is this going to happen to me? And it can also be a traumatic experience, even though it's secondary to them as well.
Absolutely. I think that is so key. And I remember that once when the election happened, my clients got so agitated, and they were actually traumatized by some of the things that was going on in the news. And it showed up directly in their classroom. They're not able to pay attention. They're worried about their families. They're worried about their friends. They're worried about their safety. And they're worried about who they are showing up as little Black boys and little Black girls, or Latina boys and girls in society. And so those were very traumatic experiences for those students. And so, Latasha, as we get ready to wind down, and I'm going to ask the audience if they have any questions for you all, because this is a very well-versed panel that's sharing their expertise about trauma in children and teens. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the question bar. And if you're catching us on the replay, also drop your questions in so that we can continue this very valuable discussion. But Latasha, I want you to talk about, how, I know we don't have enough time for the full discussion, but how do you see trauma in our little Black boys and Black girls, and our little Latina boys and girls, especially with the immigration issues and things that's going on in today's society?
Oh man, just to try to unpack that just a little bit, I think on a regular basis, you're having they experience bullying, racial slurs. These things have them scared to go in the classroom, maybe isolating from their peers. They develop a lot of issues with self-esteem as it relates to that, avoidance, not wanting to attend school. And then also a lot of times with a Latino population, worried about their families. I mean, it's televised, so it's a lot of media coverage when we see a lot of immigrants being deported. They're worrying, is this going to happen to my family member? Am I going to be taken away? These are the things that they're having to deal with on a daily basis when getting dressed just to head out to go to school. Even with a little bit of the older population, worried, they may be experiencing some workplace discrimination, but may be fearful to even speak up about it because they may not be documented or able to really be here and feel somewhat trapped in that situation. As for our African American children, the same thing. I think they are exposed on a regular basis, and definitely being a little bit more insensitive about the situations now, because being frustrated about being called names, the racial slurs that are going on, you may see the children begin to act out, be a little bit more aggressive. just because maybe they may be tired of hearing those racial slurs, sometimes also feeling inferior. And so that's why when we're able to have that uncomfortable conversation and have that dialogue about race relations and help empower our minorities, make sure that they have a good positive self-image about themselves, they know their history and where they come from, that can, help them in how they cope. And then also connect them to some strong role models as well.
That is so key. Again, the relationship, that's one of the main things that counter trauma. And the other thing that's going on, and I'm touching on these things and I'm not really doing it justice, but the other thing that's going on that's traumatizing our students, our children, our clients also, are the school shootings that's happening. And I think it's important that parents have those conversations with their students about, with their children about what's happening in the schools, because their children might not want to go to school. They might be showing signs of PTSD. And you might not recognize it because you're saying, well, there was never a shooting at his or her school, but still there's that secondary impact that is just as important. Can one of you speak to that?
I'm glad you brought that up as well, with the school shootings and even those kids who are not being impacted directly with that. I wanted to let the parents also know to be aware of somatic symptoms. And those are when the child is saying, I have a stomach ache, and you're going to the doctor and you're like, nothing is wrong. But that's another way of them actually protecting themselves, and where they may have the stomach ache or they might feel nauseated, and that's another anxiety symptom where I'm afraid and I don't want to go to school, because even though it didn't happen in my school, but it may happen. And you might want to start looking at their grades, because it might start affecting their grades. You might have this straight A student who starts to get B's and C's, and you're wondering what's going on. When you do see those changes in your child, we do know our children, and we sometimes we want to fix them, or we want to fix everything for them. And I know as a parent, it might be hard to actually see, okay, my child is actually going through this, like, and I can't fix it. I can't tell them, hey, you're going to go to school and be okay. But I think it is really important for us to actually validate those feelings and actually to normalize them, rather than just say, you know what, is going to be okay, because we want to do that because we want to protect them as parents, as caregivers. And that's what we want to do. And that, that's our job as parents. But it's actually important to actually normalize those feelings and to let them know, I am here to support you, and to actually have that open dialogue with them, even at the dinner table, letting them have that, allowing that space for them to feel comfortable to come to you and speak to you. In terms of with trauma and traumatic experiences, the person who gets the most support, you can have two children who goes through the same traumatic experience, but the one who gets the most support from caregivers, and the relationship is very important, is that one who can be able to overcome that trauma better than the one who did not receive that support.
That's so true. And resilience is not accidental.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Resilience, that support, that relationship, those relationships, that's what builds resilience in children. And that makes the difference if they overcome it and are able to be successful like Oprah, or if they choose a different path in life. It makes the difference, because the brain is always looking for ways to form those connections. It's always looking for craving that. But trauma, especially at an early age, can change the whole trajectory of the brain. And the brain actually develops differently for children who are exposed to traumatic experiences. And so it is so important that we pay attention to this. We have one question. How do you take a step back and take care of yourself when you are counseling or being a sounding board for someone who has experienced trauma? What skills can you use? Can both of you give us a little example of how do you do that? And I think we do it as self-care.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump in and talk a little bit about self-care. I mean, listening to traumatic experiences every day, it can be emotional draining. And so I think we need to make sure that you're having that time to kind of just debrief or decompress when you are. So let's say when you're leaving the workplace, are you having just that one-on-one time? Are you having time for meditation or prayer or whatever that looks like for you? Also being able to make sure that you're getting proper rest. You need to be able to have, your proper sleep, proper diet, things of that nature, exercise to be able to release some of that stress, and then indulging in pleasure activities. Whatever that looks like for you. It may be shopping, it may be some form of entertainment, spending time with friends. And then I would just say, lastly, this is something I use personally, just having a good support system. I do have colleagues that I can, talk with about, stories or cases that are pretty complex and kind of get some advice about that particular case, or just process it so that I can kind of leave it there and when I leave for the day. So those are just a few things that personally that I do to take care of myself, to make sure that I'm not burnt out, when we look at this vicarious trauma.
Wow, that's good stuff. I'm going to let you go, Sarah, but let me welcome Kelly and Catrice. Thanks for joining us. And Samara, thanks for joining us. Tina, I'm so glad you're here with us. We're having this really good discussion about childhood trauma and its effects on teens, especially. Okay, Sarah, what about self-care? How do we do that?
In terms of self-care, personally, and just like Latasha said, actually having a strong support system is very important, and having those you can go to and actually telling them, hey, can I vent a little, and release what's going on, and actually speak my narrative of what's going on and I've been experiencing. I find that very helpful when I do talk about and I have that sounding board, and I do talk about without even having to give any information, confidential information about my clients. It has actually helped. And sleep is very important, to get a good amount of sleep, and also to be aware of when you are experiencing secondary trauma, and when it is becoming to affect you. When you're sleep dreaming about it, and you can't stop thinking about it. And we try not to bring work home, but that's something kind of like inevitable, because it's our passion, it's our life's passion, and that's what we're doing, and that's what it's our life, being clinicians and actually going out there and helping others heal. But I think your healing as a clinician is also very important, because if you don't address how it's affecting you, how can I be present for my client, and how can I be able to help them start to overcome and conquer what they're going to if I'm not taking care of myself.
I think that's really, really important. And the therapist healing themselves also is very important. And it's recommended that therapists have their own therapists that they go to, which is so important. And I'm just going to speak a little bit to the parents who are going through this experience with children who are experiencing trauma. And I'm going to say, first of all, if your child discloses things to you, and again, we talk about trauma being on a wide spectrum, from sexual abuse to being bullied to being in a car accident, or to hear about a shooting on the next block, right? Trauma runs the spectrum. And so for parents, it is so important that, first of all, you create an environment where your child can talk to you about it, right? And also that you validate them and not shame them for bringing forth their story to you. It's important that as a parent, you're in a position to protect your child. And if you're not in a position, find somebody who can offer that protection for your child. And for parents, setting boundaries and ground rules and expectations and things like that in the home is really important because children need that structure. They need consistency. They need you to be engaged in their upbringing. And so that helps also to buffer against trauma and also to help support children who are in trauma. We need boundaries and consistency. And also parents, for you to seek your own support system. That is key, that you have your support system. In some families who are not functioning properly, they turn to the children for support. And that's the inverted support system. Parents, make sure you set up your own support system so that you have peers, you have a counselor, you have people who are giving you support to be that parent for that child or for those children. It is very, very important that you take care of your own needs as parents and find your own recreation as parents that's healthy and can help to support your family. So as we come to the end of this segment, I just think it was a very important segment. Tisha has a question, and she said, "What do you recommend for discipline redirecting a 5-year-old child who's experiencing trauma?" So Sarah, I want you to take that one.
Okay. In terms of disciplining, now when you say discipline, now you're telling them what you're doing is bad. So the way that they will interpret that is, okay, what I'm going through is not important. You don't get me. So I wouldn't really say discipline that child, but I would say support that child for what they're going through and ask them, okay, so I see that you're mad, you're very angry, so put life into the feelings that they're having. And I want to help you, and also getting that help from someone who whether it's a therapist or someone who can actually work together with you as a parent to create a treatment plan or to help that child. I wouldn't say discipline, because when you start to think of it as, okay, what they're doing is it's telling that child that what they're doing is bad, and the way that they would interpret it is
I'm bad.
I'm bad and it's my fault what I'm going through. I'm not worth it. And no one cares about what I'm feeling. I'm trying the best that I can to let you know that I'm angry, and all you're saying is, you know what, you need to stop it. And I would say more so give that child support and try to find out why they're acting the way that they're acting. I think it's very important that we try to find out the cause of that behavior, and then to start giving them the support and actually maybe seeking treatment for the family as a whole. So you can learn different tools, different parenting techniques to be able to help address the behavior as well, but not ignoring why they're behaving the way that they are.
Right. So she says, Tisha says, the child is having behavioral problem and destructive behaviors. And so I'm thinking about what we were talking about before, that says that every behavior is telling a story. Every behavior is asking for something to be addressed. And so even in getting help for that child, Tisha, and having somebody to help them to channel and express their behavior. Some children learn how to do it through art. They learn how to do it through different, and Sarah, you probably have more experience in this area than me, different ways that children learn how to express their behaviors so that it's not destructive.
At this point, if the child is having behavior problem and they're being destructive, it's a time to get help. And telling you to get help, even as a parent, that doesn't mean that you're less of a parent, or something is wrong with you. No, now is the time for you to get somebody on board to support you as well as a parent, and actually to support that child. And I've seen how art has worked. Some children, they like to draw, and then when they start to draw in color, they might start to draw, start to speak their narrative of that trauma. And also helping them to actually reframing or putting words to what's going on. Actually, I'm not saying not to address those behaviors, because when they become destructive, you want to also make sure your child is safe. That's so also find a way to instead of kicking your friend, and instead of breaking things, start saying, I'm angry, and I'm angry because, started there, or I'm sad because. So teach them how to speak. And that's where the trauma narrative come, when you start to teach them how to speak their truths.
Right. That's good stuff. For Latasha, Tina wants to know, how do you heal when there are so much trauma in our lives? As African American women, we have so much daily traumas. I'm thinking it says it's challenging to find ways to heal. What would you say to her?
Well, I would say, for starters, don't try to heal alone. That's the best thing. Like I say, seek professional help. And I think definitely in our culture, that's something that has traditionally been difficult. Now I'm working really hard to break that stigma associated with seeking, professional help. Um, but I think, don't try to heal alone. Go get some professional help where you're able to have a safe environment that you can talk a little bit about that complex trauma. If it's things that you've experienced from childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, on up until now, that's complex trauma. So it's not something that's going to go away overnight. So I would start there. And then, having a good therapist as well. You want to have someone that specializes in dealing with trauma, so that not only will they unpack some of these traumatic experiences, but they'll know how to address them, and they'll be able to use specific treatment modalities that are effective when helping people heal from trauma. So, like, for instance, one may be EMDR, that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And that is a specific treatment modality in which you're able to go in and reprocess that traumatic experience and help, so that it's not as distressing. So it doesn't erase it, but if it's affecting your functionality, you can actually regain your functionality. And that's just one particular type. But I would say seek professional help. Journaling is something that you could do, at home, to be able to deal with it. Read a lot of self-help books, so that some steps, and kind of do some emotional work on your own. So those are just a few things off the top of my head. But the number one thing, like I said, is take the step, get help, whatever it is, but don't try to do it alone. And I wholeheartedly believe in the work that we do. And it's very rewarding to me, for me to help clients be able to gain their functionality back, and to relive, to get through that traumatic experience, and kind of get to a place and where they have just happiness, and joy, and they've been able to release some of that shame and guilt that has been holding them hostage for a majority of their life. So I hope that's been helpful to you.
Wow. Thank you. That's real good stuff. You all have been so amazing being here with me tonight on Teen Talk Live, where we're talking about childhood trauma as a response to the CBS 60 Minutes that was aired yesterday with Oprah. I'm so glad that I had these wonderful clinicians who were here to share their expertise. And I'm just going to give you a minute to say who you are again, Latasha, and then Sarah, and how can people find you in the world? Where can they find your information, and how can they get your services?
Okay, my name again is Latasha Carter. You can visit my website, that's latashacarter.com. LATASHACARTER.com. I am CEO of Therapeutic Connections, so I own a private practice in Greensboro, North Carolina. I also offer virtual sessions for those of you who may not be in my local area. So if you're interested in speaking to me a little bit offline, please contact me there. All of my contact information, and I'll give you my number. It's 336-310-9340.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And Sarah, tell us again who you are and where can we find you in the world?
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Sarah Elise, and I am a psychotherapist, and I own a practice, Sound Mind Wellness Center in Miami Gardens, Florida. And my number where you can reach me is 954-317-9161. And you can actually visit my website at www.soundmindwellness.com. And there you're able to book a session with me. I offer virtual therapy as well, and in the office therapy to women, children, and teenagers.
Excellent. And again, I'm so grateful for all our guests who joined us this evening to talk about this important topic. And if you have questions afterwards, please drop them in the comment box. And please, for the 10 of you who are on this broadcast, please hit share, because this is such an important dialogue that we had tonight, and we need to get it out to our community, and we need to have more dialogues like this. Again, this is Ann Dillard with Teen Talk Live, and I'm so glad you've joined us, because we believe in transforming the lives and minds of teens and those who love them. Ladies, thank you so much for being here with me. I respect you all as colleagues, and I appreciate your input in tonight's session.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.